it sometimes shows up there first.
Oh, we're live.
Oh, okay. Okay. Welcome to Hopeifiers. This is Alan Friesen. I'm here with Mr. Scott Sweetman. If you tuned in the past and said, hey, Hopeifiers, I thought that was with that Daniel Zapula. Daniel's out improving his golf swing. So Scott and I are giving a whack at some interesting, engaging conversations.
And he's way more handsome than I am, so people have probably recognized that I'm not Daniel.
So, Scott Sweetman, we have a kind of a challenge question for today. I brought it up last week, and then we thought we'd discuss it and try and kind of flesh it out a little bit. And we did post our phone number as well. If somebody else wants to call in and put in their 2 cents worth, well, please do. But the question is this. We generally recognize that there's past, and for many of us, past means something that we're thinking about with regret, or we shouldn't have said that, or I wish I didn't do this, or future, which we're thinking about in a worried, geez, I'm concerned that this is going to happen and that's going to happen, or this present moment. And like if most of the gurus will tell you this present moment is all you have. This present moment is it. And if in this present moment you want for nothing, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you don't have to go to the bathroom, you're not in pain, this present moment is a pretty beautiful place. But what if in this present moment I am engaging my imagination faculties and I'm using my imagination in this present moment? Am I in this present moment, or am I in the future? What do you think, Scott?
I think it's a great question. And so in a past life, I was a medievalist. I was a historian and really spent a lot of time studying medieval religious communities. And a great thing that I took away from that is old naval maps of the time. On the edges of the land that they knew really well, they just wrote something really profound like, "Here be dragons."
Oh, yeah.
And so tonight's show is kind of "Here be dragons." And we should preface this with that. The opposite of what you see on TV all the time. We are not trained professionals. We're going to be talking about philosophy and all sorts of things. So please do this at home. Do your own research. Don't trust us. This is only to give you some hope and motivate you to go look at things in your own way. So I think we can put that out there, Al, don't you?
You know what? And just you recall the quote that we both love from Rumi, right? There are 1,000 ways to reach out and kiss the earth. So this might be, if Scott and I are all excited about what we come up with, this might be our way, might not be your way, but it might be one of those 1,000 ways.
Exactly.
Right, Scott?
Yeah. So I went looking at we talked about, the premise was, do people or do different cultures or different perspectives view time in such a way that when you imagine or when you dream, that there's a time shift that goes on. We normally think of that, the Western view of time, and I'm going to lump everyone together, and hopefully people won't call in and tell me that I'm generalizing, because I am, and that's okay. It'll move the conversation forward. Is in the West, we often think of a linear concept of time, right? We think of like the arrow that moves through time. We think that time has, very set parameters. It's always there. It's always moving forward. It flows. It runs like a river, and it has a direction. It always advances, right? I mean, that's a very Western perspective of time. Everything, our literature, our culture, our personal lives are organized around that concept of time. And in modern physics and mathematics, that concept has been challenged. But it was challenged prior to that by different cultures who have different beliefs and different understandings of the relationship to us and time. So what I did is I went back and looked at where physicists and mathematicians really are on this concept of, does time exist, right? That's the first question to get to the point we want to be. Do you think time exists, Al? Is it real for you?
No, it's a concept. It's just a man-made thing that we made up. It doesn't exist. This moment is all that exists.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because when you look at, and two fields have really pulled out in front, and that's quantum mechanics and the relativity theory. Okay. And those two are really important, because in relativity theory, time is not a constant. it's a perspective, right? So everything is relative to one's own position. So the reason I believe right now that it's 7:05 is because I have an anchor, right? It's on my wrist. I have an anchor that tells me, that gives me a reference point, right? So I perceive my reality based on that anchor, that reference point, right? But you've traveled out. You know that when you travel, time changes, right?
Yes.
So, my daughters had their birthday recently, and they were born in Japan. So they were actually born on the 11th of July in Japan, but that was the 10th of July here. So now that we've moved back, they sort of celebrate their birthday for like a week straight, but 2 days, because they always say, "Oh, Dad, are we celebrating Japanese time or Canadian time? Which is the right one?"
So it's both.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's completely made up, right?
Right.
They were born for us at one particular point, but then we can move our perspective backward and forward, right? To my mother, when I called and said, we had twins, that was on the 10th. But for me, it was on the 11th. And so there is that relativeness to time, right?
Right.
And so, again, it's way deeper than that, but that's just touching the surface.
Sure. Time is really what we agree it to be, right? And we agree on time zones because we're just trying to make it convenient so that we're trying to figure out when people are going to be asleep or awake with time zones, right?
Well, and what's really, sorry, I'll go ahead.
No, and just all something we made up. It's a convention that we made to try and make order in our world, right?
It is, and it isn't. And so that there's an interesting fact. I was reading if we created this, why did we create it, right? And a lot of that is to do with our perspective and our narrative, right? So from our perspective, the sun comes up every day and it goes down every day, right? And the moon comes up and the moon goes down. But it could be the other way. Like if we were nocturnal, it would be the opposite.
Sure.
To that, right?
Yeah.
You can think about it and this ties into the second part. I'm not going on a rant here, but I was really surprised when I went to Japan and I saw Australian maps. Australia looked upside down to me because in an Australian atlas, right, ours are all oriented to North America,
right,
and theirs were oriented to their particular understanding. So everything was the opposite way around. Japan, when I was there, they were in the center and everything was pushed off to the sides. So there's a physical distortion that takes place relative to your particular perspective, right? The quantum mechanics, and I'm a little fuzzy on the whole difference between quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and I'm sorry I've just insulted two large groups of hugely important people that study some really serious stuff that, although I did take some of it, can barely comprehend. And that's that time is part of what they call a block universe model. So time doesn't exist separately from space and things. It's not a separate entity of its own. It's part of this stuff, right? This block universe that they call it.
Okay.
And then the third view is that most of us go around and we just accept that the way we create the world, i.e. my daughters were born on the 11th, where my mother thinks they were born on the 10th, is about perspective, right? And so time, we've created clocks. And this is really interesting. I hadn't thought about this before. And so clocks give us that anchor, right? And you and I agree, if we're going to have a meeting, you and I have to be in the same time zone, right? Like if we say we're going to meet at 7 and my watch is running late, then we've got a problem because I think it's, 6, but it's actually 7, right? So my perception gets skewed and I believe that it's 6 based only on my anchor, which is my wristwatch or my phone or whatever, right? So you're with me on that.
You bet.
But watches make very, very poor clocks because a good clock has a feature that it doesn't repeat. Okay. But when we develop time, even a 24-hour clock, the time repeats. So we had to develop a second anchor called a calendar. We did it the other way first, maybe.
Mhm.
so that we can tell 11 o'clock today from 11 o'clock yesterday and 11 o'clock tomorrow.
Mhm.
So our
Okay.
watches aren't capable of that,
Right.
right? So
Okay.
the anchor we use, even though we think about it, we have to rely on a second piece of technology we created to orientate us in, well, are we in the past or the future or the present based on that calendar?
Right.
Right?
Right.
You
Yeah.
with me so far?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. You're
And
you're bringing. You're trying to clarify the concept of time in relation to this question that we're talking about. Yes.
yeah, right.
Yep.
So that we know going into it that there's no one really agrees on time because there's like four main theories of it. And the point that I'm trying to get through here, because it's relative when we start talking about dreaming and imagination, is that really it is about our perspective, right? It's about what I create as a reality. I say that it is July 29th, 7:05, 7:11 p.m. And I use an anchor called a calendar and a clock that the people around me have agreed upon to use. And that's how I know that this moment is this moment and not some other moment.
Right. Okay.
Right? Okay. So your question is, or your answer is, well, there is nothing but what's happening right now, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
some people would disagree with that. They would say, no, I can pour a glass of water and I can see as time passes that the water flows into the other vessel or spills out on the floor. So I can see the passage of time. I can see that I get older and I'm born a baby and I die. So therefore time flows. But what we forget is that's from our unique perspective using the anchors that we've created and tell ourselves our objective reality, not subjective. But when you get into advanced physics and mathematics, they would say, no, those are subjective realities, right?
Right.
And that's where we get back to, time zones and timelines and late watches and things. Time is what it is because we all say, okay, we're going to agree on this. Okay. Now, when you dream, what do you think happens, Al?
Well, I think that mine was more about imagination than dreaming, but fair statement that you're dreaming. I guess it is occurring in this present time, but the concept of what time is can be very fluid in your dream, right?
The reason I took it to dreams is because a lot of research in the Western world equates imagination to a skill of the conscious mind.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
Okay? Right? So creativity comes from experiences and things, pathways that we can develop and open up. And, if I put you in a box, you're either going to shut down or you're going to become completely withdrawn and creative because there's no other reality around you. So dreaming and imagination are separate in that one of them is considered a conscious activity and one of them is considered an unconscious activity.
Okay.
Generally in Western science, right?
Sure. That makes sense. Sure.
So when you imagine that, I'll rephrase that. When you imagine, are you in the past, present, or future?
Yeah. Well, that was my question to you.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that if you're in the present and you're imagining, let's say you're imagining just a concept, you're imagining peace and love and joy and hope, then I think you're in the present moment. If I'm imagining an activity that in the future that could happen that maybe I'm looking forward to, hey, I'm gonna have lunch with Scott tomorrow, and I'm imagining that lunch and the things we're going to talk about, then I think I'm in the future. I'm not really in this present moment.
But if we've agreed that the present is a construct based on our perspective, right?
So we agreed that time was a construct, and calendars and clocks were the anchors for that construct.
Right. But present is just a word that we've prescribed a uniqueness or a hierarchy to, right?
Okay. Yeah.
We've assigned that as being special.
Okay.
Where when you look at relativity, there's nothing special about it. Past, present, and future all exist.
Yes.
Okay. So, right. When you think of the present, You're talking about something that you and I have created and we agree between us is happening according to a set of anchors that we subjectively have agreed upon and created ourselves.
Well, here's what I don't get about that.
Okay.
Time, I understand about it being a construct. I get that.
Yeah.
But the present moment we could experience without a clock or a calendar. Like if we were just sitting watching the sunset in this present moment, we'd just be enjoying this present moment. And we wouldn't need a clock or a calendar to inform that present moment, right?
Okay, but the reason we see it in the past and the future is because we've created that construct. So if you look at cultures, and this answers the question we we're talking about.
Okay.
So for example, I was in Asia for a long time. A lot of cultures there see time as occurring in a circular pattern. Right?
Okay.
So it doesn't progress like the arrow, it progresses like a wheel. It goes around and around, right? Rather than straight.
Okay.
And so they see time as coming back upon itself. And then there's cultures and groups, if you look at South America and you look at Africa and some parts of Asia, where time has no meaning at all. There's things that they see in the world around them that they accept to be objective, and that's the relationship that they connect to things. And in that way, they create a reality that is without past, present, and future. It simply is. So in the language they use to discuss it, the language they use to share with each other, there's no way for us to tell whether they're talking about the past, present, or future, because it's perceived as simply something that is, right? So the last time you and I talked last Thursday is we agree that it happened last Thursday, but we have to reference those anchors, right?
Right. Sure.
Can we talk about last Thursday without our anchors?
No, I don't think so.
So
yeah,
is beyond the subjective reality that we give it, and this is where we get into physics, that reality exists in a time and a place not unlike this time and place.
Right.
So the we've created a reality where we say things that happened on my calendar at this place belong in the past, and things that happen at this place belong in the future. And so when you're imagining, you're saying that, or not you, but people either think that it's a mental process that's occurring in the present, and it has nothing to do with time, that it is like breathing. It's something that occurs on an ongoing basis and happens in what we call the present. And then there are people that believe that imagination is actually accessing other points in time or other points in either a revolving continuum or a reality that's not organized to a subjective anchor of time and calendars and watches and those things that we've created. And physicists, and this is what I found interesting, and I can give you a couple of sources to look up, where their argument for this is that, we evolved as, carbon-based life forms, we evolved on Earth, we understand the Earth and the universe in a certain way, right? And our whole understanding of the universe comes about because of the subjective anchors that we've chosen to look at. But if you chose other anchors, you would get a completely different view of the universe.
Okay.
So
what I'm hearing you saying, what I think you're saying is, if we used we used the movement of glaciers as some kind of reference for time, as an example. Yes. Obviously, we would view the world quite differently than if we're looking at a calendar and a clock.
Yes.
Is that correct? That's what you're saying, right?
But the physicists that I was reading and listening to took it a step farther. And so if we calculated time by rabbits instead of ours, we would get a completely different view of this conversation when it occurred.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Because, and I picked out rabbits, it doesn't really make sense, but that's because it's not supposed to make sense, right?
Right.
Time makes sense to us because we've studied it, we've constructed it, we're taught about it as children. It's become so ingrained in us that it's no longer considered to be subjective, it's considered to be objective.
Right. Right.
Okay? And so I think that imagination occurs in whatever place you consider this time to exist in. So for people that don't have the same anchors that we do, calendars, watches, those things that we accept as a normal passing of time. And of course, as the world was colonized and, to other cultures that were being colonized, that was a really traumatic and, shearing event, because they were forced to adapt our anchors in lots of things, not just time and space, but religion.
Even that land could be owned. That somebody could own it, right? That was, well, how does this make any sense, right?
Because that's an anchor we chose. We said, we created what we considered an objective reality. And like most people in a Western civilization believe, of course, everything is owned by someone. Nothing exists without ownership. And, if you listen to politicians who think that way, they may say, humanity owns the earth, to make it pluralistic rather than saying I own the earth. But they're really saying the same thing, right? So in cultures where they don't have those anchors, I think two things occur. They're not as aware of imagining as they are as we are, being somehow different than the experiences we're having when we're not imagining. And so I'll just skip to dreams to give you an example, but it applies exactly the same to imagination.
Okay.
So there's people in South America, and this is a document written by a priest, and he traveled to South America, and he was shocked by how many of his congregants were confessing adultery. And he's like, I can't believe this. This is crazy. Until he realized that in their culture, if they dreamt about someone other than their wife in a sexual way, they considered that adultery. They considered that to be exactly the same as committing the physical act of adultery. And so in their culture, because they had never anchored a separation between a dream state and an awake state, it was real to them. So when somebody asked them, they answered with what they believed to be true. They had committed adultery.
Right.
And it wasn't about, dreaming of lust and those types of things. It was that in their culture, and this occurred in South America, and I apologize for not remembering the tribe's name, but somebody can email me or look it up like I did. And it explains it much better than I can. But I think imagination is like that too. And so if people don't have the same anchors that we do, then imagination may not happen in a separate time at all. Or it may be access to a separate time and a place and a thing and abilities. And when we look at cultures, again, different from our own, or very different from our own in what they consider anchors, often things that happen in the abstract, or what we would consider psychological, are real. They're not separate from reality. But we're not too distant from that in our own. So as I said, I studied the medieval church and religious communities. And I used to give a great lecture on the community of the living and the dead in medieval England primarily, but Europe, and how dead people were not considered to be in another time or place. They were considered to be here and now, and we just couldn't see them.
Got it.
And so, and then that progressed into, purgatory and all sorts of other things due to belief in politics and finances and all sorts of other anchors. But the concept was Now we think of the deceased as being in the past, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
You
we
know,
certainly do. At least their physical body, anyways. They're
yeah,
right.
sure. But there was a time, even in Western civilization, where we didn't believe that. We believed they were still here with us now,
Hmm.
in the present.
Yeah.
Okay? And so we didn't have to reach back to access them. All we did was have to reach through the barrier between the community of the living and the community of the dead.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think, and I'm stretching it, Al, I know,
Mm-hmm.
but I think in answer to your question, I think that there's that perception. Are we really reaching forward or back, or are we reaching through one thing to another thing? How do you feel when you're imagining?
I don't know. Like I'm just actually kind of getting engaging my imagination abilities more than I have in the past.
Mhm.
I'm trying to take some time more to just like think and imagine, just like just reflect and imagine kind of a thing. And so I don't know. I really think it's more of a present in the present activity because it could be so yes, I think it's just basically a pattern I'm following in my mind at this present time that's engaged in thinking about more conceptually, emotionally, more about what the future, what I perceive the future should look like, or what I'm hoping it'll look like, or that kind of a thing.
But
I
if you
think.
listen to gurus, Western gurus as well, they'll
Yeah.
tell you not to imagine it, to believe it. And when you believe it, it
True.
becomes true, right?
Right. Yes.
And so, when you were sort of explaining that, I was thinking, okay, Al's anchoring this so that it makes sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
To my mind, to your mind, to our conversation that we're having in this construct of Western society in Lethbridge, Alberta in 2021 by our calendar. It makes sense.
Right.
But there's other ways to look at it that are just as viable,
Sure.
where this conversation is not separate from our conversation that occurred last Thursday.
Right.
It's just part of the same.
Right.
And the fact that we assign past to it is irrelevant. That's for our benefit. Right.
So in a culture then that doesn't recognize time, right? Doesn't, like, they have no clocks, they have no calendars, they go by the seasons and the sun and how high the sun is and the hot sky and all those kind of things, let's say. So for those cultures, then, is everything in the present moment for them? Are they not? They have no. They're not plagued by concerns from the past or worries of the future if they have no concept of time.
I think largely one could argue that they are. I think that we see, and linguistics is something that has interested me because of my current field, and that's working in advertising and managing image and perspective and relationships, is that the language that we create to explain things often causes us to feel good or stressful or bad, and the language we use. So if we don't have to create a construct in language to explain that someone is deceased, so they're no longer here, then do we suffer that sense of loss? Like when I looked at medieval communities in depth, and I studied them when I was at Cambridge and did a lot of research into it, the people didn't have that same sense of loss that we have now.
If they perceived that they were still with him, they haven't.
That's right. Exactly.
They're still Uncle Henry's here. Why we just can't see him?
That's
so there was no real loss.
That's right. They had different obligations, and because they couldn't communicate in the way they had in the past, they had to make concessions for that. But there was no sense. There was a sense of loss. Yes, they're not here. I can't physically touch them and hug them, but there was not the sense that I've left them behind in my journey, and I'm moving forward where they've stopped moving forward.
Right. They were still with at the same time, existing with. Yeah. Yeah.
So when I've seen tribes, and not seen them personally, but I did have a great professor in university who spent most of his time in Papua New Guinea. And so we talked a lot about the people he lived with and worked with in Papua New Guinea. And we talked about time, and we talked about creativity in terms of art and in terms of creating things. And he felt that we create a lot of the language when we're and I'm looking back, given my current research, is that basically language serves to anchor things in that subjective reality we create. So if we don't create words for stressful things, do they really exist? If we can't communicate them, can we think about them? Like, can you think about something that you can't articulate?
Yeah, I see what your point is. Sure. Yeah.
You know, and so do the things that those people not think about because they've never created that anchor.
Right.
Does it worry them? I don't think so. You know, in the same way that my medieval community believed that the dead were with them.
Yes. Yes.
And could see everything they did, and they, you know, it was sort of a one-way mirror situation. So they didn't feel that they were alone or separate from that.
Right.
Where today we usually see people that have been deceased in our past. You know, we put it on their headstone, so we know where to place them in our anchor. And so I think imagination suffers. Can I say that? And I don't mean that maybe judgmentally, but I think it's built into that construct where we say, I'm existing here in this place. If I'm imagining it, it's somehow an artificial construct that is only happening in my head with firing electrons and chemicals and the things that allow me to think and articulate those thoughts. But other cultures certainly don't believe that.
No.
They believe that thinking about things can manifest them.
Right.
Saying words can manifest those things, and those things are real.
Right.
As real as you and I think that they're not.
Right. Well, and also you would reference it about gurus who were, you know, or spiritual advisors, whichever, that would say, hey, you have this, you know, don't use your imagination, use your belief that this is right, that you have amazing health. You know, you
make it till you make it, right?
Yeah. Don't imagine this, believe it. Just believe that you have amazing health and it will be yours, that kind of a thing. Right. So cool.
And that movement happens in our culture on sort of a reoccurring basis.
Does
right? Like, you know, 20 years ago, there was a big movement in, you know, believe in it and, you know, affirm it and it'll become reality. Right? Don't think about it. Don't wish for it. You know, basically will it into being. Believe that it's real and it will be real. And when we look around the world, there's cultures that still believe exactly that.
Yeah.
So cool. I think that imagination occurs exactly where we think it occurs.
Yeah.
And if we think it occurs now as a construct of a chemical and electrical process in our brains between our subconscious and our conscious and our experiences, whether we're aware of them or not aware of them, then that's exactly where it's placed. But if we take it as, you know, I'm thinking about cultures where they would assign things not to their individual creativity, but to their ancestors or to spirits, sharing with them knowledge or skills or solutions to problems that we would attribute to creativity or imagination, they attribute to the voices or their spirit animals or
they're being guided by by the connectivity that they have. Yes. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So, you know, and turn of the century anthropologists just labeled all of that imagination. Which now we're saying, oh, that's insensitive, you know, to those cultures, that's unfair. That's our belief. But to those cultures, we don't have the right to say those things weren't real.
True.
And I think that more than just being politically correct and being sensitive, I think there's some wisdom in that as well.
Yeah, makes sense.
And I think that, you know, as those anchors we talked about, sometimes anchors stop us from moving, right? That's their purpose.
That's their purpose. Yeah, exactly.
But if you want to move forward or if you want to change, and this gets back to the theme of our show, if you want to change where you are, and you want to move in a different direction, you have to let go of the anchors.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And so maybe letting go of those anchors are hearing your ancestors. Maybe they're being guided instead of calling it creativity and saying, oh, I have to be creative and I have to think harder and I have to, this is the path. Maybe what we need to do is let go of those anchors and open ourselves up to different opportunities and different constructs of exactly what imagination is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good insight, Scott. Yeah. So if we were more receptive to or open to guidance that maybe we don't even ascribe a source for where that came from, right? This could be wisdom from smart Uncle Harry, and here's what he has to tell me. That's awesome. That kind of a thing, right? So, yeah.
Well, everyone, and I've studied psychology, and I can't say, I don't know. I was really close to my paternal grandmother. My parents were divorced, dad left, grandma and grandpa were always there. They raised us. My mother did all the physical work, but they were always there, great emotional supports. And they were getting up there in age. And I used to, when I was a little kid, my grandmother taught me how to dance, if you can imagine. And in the kitchen of our farmhouse.
Nice.
And, and she was very interested in spirituality and mediums, and she really believed in a world beyond what we could see or hear with our five senses. And, she said, when I die, because I was, we were talked about a lot dying, and I said, I'm going to really miss you, Grandma. It's going to be really hard when you pass away because you're a big part of my life. And, I don't know how I'm going to deal with that. And she said, I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you I'm okay. And okay, that's nice. Love you too, Grandma. Yay. And some years later, I was sitting in our living room and I fell asleep, and I dreamt about my grandmother, and I dreamt about dancing with my grandmother in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And Grandma said, I'm okay. No. And I just dreamed, okay, I woke up, I went to bed. Next morning, my father called and he said, Scott, Mom's dead. Mm-hmm. And she had died that night of a heart attack. And okay. Yeah, I know. My Western science mind says, nice coincidence, buddy. Or did your grieving mind go back and create those memories, or who knows? Yeah. But I can say with absolute certainty, in other cultures, in other places, there would be no question that my grandmother fulfilled her promise.
Sure. Yes.
To come back to me and tell me that she was okay.
Right.
And so
if you were a member of that community, you shared that with somebody else, they'd say, of course, that's great that Grandma came back and told you that, right? Or Grandma shared that.
There'd be no question. There wouldn't have to be a giggle and, a caveat, and that I'm not crazy.
Exactly. Nobody be getting out the prescription pad and saying, ooh, here, Scott.
Yeah. And I think that's the hope of letting go of some of those anchors, because a lot of anchors aren't good anchors.
Yes.
A clock and a calendar might be a good anchor because it allows you and I to show up here on time and share this great hour together, and hopefully share some hope with some other people.
Right.
But, if it's causing you a lot of stress, if it causes you a lot of pain, then are those anchors so good?
Right.
We create those anchors.
Right. Yep.
Like it's my daughters. Were they born on the 11th or were they born on the 10th?
Right. Yeah.
My mother says the 10th because that's when she got the call.
Right.
I say the 11th because I was standing in Japan and it was 11 o'clock. It was on the 11th on the calendar. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And, that's a great analogy. That's a great story, Scott.
Well, I think your question brought that out, and I think when you first hit me with it, I was like, "Whoa, how are we going to deal with that?" It took me down lots of different roads.
Yes.
But once I started looking at it, and once the physicists really started talking about the anchors that we anchor our reality to, or our subjective definition of reality,
right,
that really got me thinking about, well, okay, how do I bring that into my life, and how do I make that useful to myself and to other people? Mm-hmm. And that really came down to, okay, that's really cool. I understand that. But you know what? Like everything, there's good and bad. And I started thinking about it. And, I hang on to anchors that are really bad for me. And my reality would be better without those anchors.
Yeah. Yeah. And just what it makes me think of too, Scott, is I don't know if you and I've talked about it much, the man box thing. And those
Yes.
are anchors where men, boys, are kind of anchored in this. They have to behave in a certain way because of how they've been conditioned to say this is what a man means. Man doesn't ask for help. Man doesn't, endures pain. Those kind of things, right? And those are really counterproductive to having a full human existence, right? So, yeah.
Recently, I've been encountering literature on two spirits, people with two spirits.
Yeah.
And it goes way beyond masculine and feminine. I mean, absolutely no offense to anyone with my ignorance, but it's been really interesting to me to look at a reality where those are not binary identities, right?
Right.
And that goes into your man box idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the reality I grew up in, male and female were extreme binaries to one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There was no crossover.
No.
God help you if you showed any crossover either way.
Right on. Yeah, exactly.
And you grew up in that culture too.
Definitely.
As a young man, boy, you didn't walk a certain way. You didn't let your wrist go limp. That was a Freudian slip, perhaps. You didn't let your wrist go limp when you were shaking hands. You didn't talk in a high voice. I remember when I went through puberty and my voice started cracking. I psychologically thought I was going to die the first time I was public speaking, and my voice went, yeah. So again, I think that your question brought out a much bigger question. This tied into having hope, and that's to really look at the anchors that you may consider to be objective, but they're not.
Right.
And there's other people that are just as valid and just as real and just as flesh and blood as you and me, who believe that the anchors that we create are not only not necessary, that they're nonsense.
Right.
And that empowers us and gives us some freedom to say, did I make that anchor? Did I believe that I had to have that anchor? And it doesn't serve who I am or who I want to be? Can I let go of that anchor rope?
Yeah, that's a very insightful question, Scott, and very good, right? What are the things, the beliefs that you have that are self-defeating or self-limiting that you have, and they could be tied on an anchor that has no value, no merit. But I got a question for you. Our indigenous brothers and sisters have a different concept of time than what you and I would have. How do you see? I don't quite understand it. I've been told it's kind of like where they see space and time as two separate things, not tied together like we would, kind of a thing. Does that make sense?
Certainly, there's physicists that would agree with that theory. I think we have to be really careful, and this is something that I experienced when I was in Japan. So Japanese history, and lots of harm was done on both sides, and atrocities were committed, and humanity should be ashamed of every war we've gotten ourselves into for the loss of life and the things that we did. So I'm not making a stand on that. And yes, there was the same thing occurred on both sides. But because Japan is an island, because it's a rather insular culture, when you look at their history, when war occurred and they were occupied, their history was sheared, and their history changes radically. And the belief systems, many belief systems, not as deeply as maybe some people would believe, but there was an outside influence. So when I look at our native Canadians, and when I get a chance to talk to them, part of the discourse is that the reality that they experienced was sheared and cut off from their original culture,
Mm-hmm.
by colonization, by conquest, by the things that we've come to associate with, one culture subjecting another culture to its beliefs, its anchors, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know in museum work, it gets really complicated to try and make generalities. But most of the Aboriginal people that I've had the pleasure of working with have been separated from their traditional culture to the point that they've adopted many of our anchors or the imposed anchors. I don't want to say our, because that not universal, but
Right.
certainly my background is from, Anglo England,
Right.
Germany, so certainly we were colonizers, not me personally, but certainly my
Right.
ancestors were. So, and they, I don't know if they were bad people, but they certainly believed that what they were doing was good in some cases, when it certainly wasn't good from our perspective now.
No. But I mean, certainly it was definitely the case that guys that look like us, kind of concluded that unless you looked like us, you weren't a human being. So then if you didn't look like us, then you could whatever you had, guys like us would take, basically. And if you're indigenous, if you're black, if you're women, for until very recently, same thing, right? You weren't really a human being, right? And every military effort in the world, what do? The enemy, these are not human beings, right? These are dogs. These are like they're not worthy of being treated like a human, is what one force would tell their people to go kill these people, right? I mean, that's kind of how it works, right? There has to be a dehumanizing element, because violence is not our norm. Violence is not how we're built. Violence is not, that is an aberration. That's not our norm, is the way I see it. Would you agree?
Yes, and no. And so, yes, I agree that absolutely what you're saying is true and a reality in many cases. When I was in Japan, the Japanese, uh, there's some, you can read The Rape of Nanking if you want a really graphic vision of when the Japanese were trying to get a continental hold on resources and expand, because Japan as an island it has a lot of resource issues in terms of energy, even in terms of food supply, things like that. But the perspective is they apologize once for those things, and the government of Japan, and they don't keep apologizing for those things, because it would be insincere, because the people doing the apologizing had absolutely nothing to do with the acts that were committed.
Okay.
And
So back me up and give me some history on this. Who were the people in Japan who regarded others as non-human and treated them horribly?
right-wing conservative party, typically the army in Japan, if you look at it historically, the Navy, the naval commander actually fought against entering into World War II. The Navy is historically more open to intercultural relations than the Army because of what they do.
Right.
The Emperor of Japan at that time, and it's hard because we're looking back at it through a lens again of being an occupying force. We were the winners, right? So there's a whole thing that was there. But I saw a meme. I don't know if I was there when I was here and I saw it, and it was ostensibly a little Japanese girl playing on the beach, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and it said, "Should she apologize for Pearl Harbor?"
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, of course, she can't. She had absolutely nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. And I'm not trying to, get out of what my ancestors did, but there would be some insincerity, I believe personally, and I mean no harm to anyone when I say this. I can apologize only to a point. And after a point, it's sympathy, not an apology.
Okay.
And I think you have to differentiate that.
Right.
Because I can't apologize for the actions of others.
Right.
I can have sympathy that someone suffered because of the actions of others.
Right.
I can try and rectify that. I can try and help make things to the best of my ability, but we try and do that for everyone, right?
Sure.
Like you and I
Yeah.
personally don't draw a line on.
Right.
I hope we don't. I think we try anyway, not
Right.
to say, we'll help these people, but not these people.
Yeah,
right?
that's an interesting comment, Scott.
And so I know that the Japanese government, there's always an issue of, how much should they pay? How much apologizing should go on? And when we were there, the government at the time said, "We've apologized, we've paid, we're done." Because we're not those people. It's no longer true and sincere. It's not a genuine apology, because we are not the people who did this.
I understand. And that I can certainly see the validity in that. I could not apologize to you for something your stepdad beat you. It would make no sense. I'm not who did that. I could feel sorry and say, shit, Scott, that should have never happened. And, that obviously it wasn't you who caused that. Little Scott didn't in any way deserve that beating, right? That kind of a thing, right? So, yeah, it's a valid point.
And I think, but we have to be careful that that's not a cop-out,
right,
for us to be active in showing sympathy and empathy and looking for solutions to systemic problems and disparities exist in culture and our organizations and our institutions. So it's not an excuse.
Right.
I know when I was in Japan, their concept of us apologizing was it would not be honorable for me to apologize for something you've done.
Got it.
To somebody that you've done it to. I can say that I feel for them,
right,
and I'll do everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Right.
But at some point, it doesn't become genuine anymore.
Okay. So now, Scott.
Sorry?
My question, though, we kind of moved away from my question. My question was, how do you, and you might not know the answer to this because I don't, but how do our Indigenous brothers and sisters differ in how they perceive time versus how we, with our anchors and how we've been socially conditioned to perceive time? How do they vary? Do you have any Indigenous friends that could say, yeah, this is why you and I don't kind of get to the same place at the same time. Here's the reason for that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think my answer to that was that most of the Indigenous people that I've had the pleasure of meeting or associating with have been impacted so greatly by colonization and dissemination of our culture that it's very hard for them to genuinely express. And I know that it's a journey that a lot of Aboriginal people and people that have been colonized around the world are going on now, is how do they reconnect to those roots?
Right.
So I know there's been a lot of stuff written about it. I know there's been a lot of self-exploration, and I think that we're in the process right now of learning those stories, and hopefully that they'll be shared with us and that we can learn. So right now, I know very little that is genuine and truthful and has been conveyed to me in the first person.
Right.
My understanding mostly comes from, again, perspectives that come from people with a cultural background like mine, rather than, and that's what people are fighting for, a voice, their own voice.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And
we need everybody's voice. We need to hear everybody's voice.
That's right.
Yes.
I'm waiting for that. So my answer is I am eagerly looking forward to a time when people have an opportunity to speak with a genuine voice, their own experience, their own perspective, and hopefully, that I'm a big enough person to be open and present in that time to hear what they're saying.
Right. Great. Scott, I think this has been a good chat.
Excellent.
So what do you think about next week? We talk about polyvagal theory. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think I know very little about it, and I think you know a lot about it. So next week, you're going to talk, and I'm going to ask you questions.
You do, and you be tough with the questions. I think I got it figured out. So if you're like, I might even have Peter Levine on speed dial. If you ask me a tough question, Peter, what's the answer to this? So so I think I understand it pretty well, and I think it's a very valuable concept in terms of your personal health, well-being, and management to understand how you can access your ventral vagus. And so that's what we're going to talk about. 3 basic things on polyvagal.
Not Las Vegas, right? We're not talking about gambling.
No Las Vegas, not Las Vegas. No. Yes. Yeah.
Cool, buddy.
Scott Sweetman, it's been a pleasure like usual. Keep yourself well, my friend, and we will talk to you next week.
Excellent. Keep the hope alive.